The Russian Left Communists were an intra-party opposition group and for a brief time presided over a mass movement across Russia in 1918. However, on the term opposition, it must be understood that this group was not opposed to Bolshevik rule or opposed to the party in such a way that opposition groups like the Socialist Revolutionaries or the Cadets would have been. Some of the hotheads, however, were prepared to split the party in the name of purity, as Lenin once had, but their struggle remained purely theoretical and never took up any militant stance. Their opposition was to perceived heresies on the part of Lenin in the year 1918. The two most well-known members of this movement were Nikolai Bukharin and Carl Radek. Other members include, but were not limited to, Nikolai Obelinsky, pseudonym Valerian Osensky, Vladimir Smirnov, Nikolai Lukin, Bela Kun, Mikhail Pokrovsky, Andrei Bubnov, Georgy Apakov, pseudonym Anafasy Lomov, Alexandra Kollontai, Vladimir Ivanov, Inessa Armand, Lev Kritzman, Yevgeny Preobrazhinsky, Georgy Pyatakov, Georgy Safarov, Timofey Sapranov, Moisey Uritsky, Vladimir Sorin, Yemelyan Yaroslavsky, Mikhail Vasiliev Yuzhin, Ivan Skortsov-Stepanov, Aaron Sultz, Innokenty Shtukov, Nikolai Murilov, Gavril Mayavznikov, and more. The elements of what would later become the leadership of the Russian left communist movement find their origins in the year 1905. Following the bloody suppression of the 1905 revolution by the Tsarist state, many young students and workers found themselves joining the ranks of the RSDLP and joining either the Bolshevik or Menshevik factions of the party. Within Moscow, there are many activists who would become future leaders of the Bolshevik Party and the left communist movement. The main figure and original leader of that movement was Nikolai Ivanovich Bukharin, whose development into a revolutionary we will briefly sketch. Bukharin was born in 1888 and came from a middle-class background, but following the events of 1905, he was stricken with a revolutionary fever. At the age of 16, he would join the Bolsheviks, and despite only just being a teen, the young Bukharin would ascend to high ranks within the party. Before his career was cut short by the Okhrana spy and high-ranking Bolshevik Malinovsky, Bukharin was engaged in several illegal activities and organized in revolutionary student groups. While enrolled at Moscow University in 1909, he would come into contact with two future comrades, Nikolai Osensky and Vladimir Smirnov, who 9 years later would form a working troika with him inside Moscow. They were first identified as a trio at the university as student Bolshevik ideologists and leaders of the theoretical raids. What drew Bukharin, Osensky, and Smirnov, as well as the other young Muscovites generally, together was their youth, shared experiences, and mutual passion for Marxist theory. All three were economists. Bukharin's eventual arrest and exile, however, was important for his development as a communist and as a left communist. For as Cohen puts it, immigration made him one of those Bolsheviks who were by experience and an outlook internationalists. For 6 years, he lived and worked among social democrats in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and the United States. He became a familiar figure among Western socialists as well as anti-socialists. To his Russian arrest were added short prison stays in Europe and Scandinavia. The left communism of Bukharin and his comrades was a hardcore internationalism. They did not conceive of the Russian Revolution as a national phenomenon, but as something of an international character. The left communists consider themselves as just but one of the detachments of the international movement. For Bukharin, the acquisition of these ideas occurs in 1915 when he travels to Vienna and familiarizes himself with the Austro-Marxist school of social democracy, and particularly with the works of the economist Rudolf Hilferding and his magnum opus, Das Finanzkapital. This book will be instrumental in the development of Bukharin, and therefore also of future Bolshevik and left communist beliefs. So, before we can talk about left communism, we must first discuss Hilferding's book, a study which itself represented a major shift in contemporary Marxist theories of imperialism and capitalism. Hilferding in Das Finanzkapital declares that at the present, liberal, laissez-faire capitalism had transformed itself into monopoly capitalism. As capitalism developed, smaller and less competitive firms and businesses were swallowed up by the competition, those firms which could outperform them on the market. The result of this was the cartelization and trustification of production and capital and ever-growing monopolies. Hilferding had also noticed that this concentration of capital was also taking place in the banking sector, leading to the existence of only a few large banks in each capitalist nation. These new banking monopolies were the primary sources of capital for the industrial sector, the chief financiers of industry, thereby creating a fusion of the banks and the industry into a Hilferding termed finance capital. Bank capital, that is, capital in monetary form, which has in this way been transformed into industrial capital, I call finance capital. Since banks were now heavily investing in certain firms, it was now in their interest to limit competition between firms to prevent bankruptcy. This new national capitalism, which had become increasingly planned and regulatory, was something Hilferding referred to as organized capitalism. This process of centralization of production and so-called organized capitalism was something Hilferding referred to as socialization of production. This socialization of production had led, according to Hilferding, to the elimination of one of the contradictions of capitalism, the anarchy of production, which in turn, according to Hilferding, paved the way for socialism and planned economy. Hilferding's study also led him to make conclusions on modern imperialism. Imperialism now was not just characterized by the avaricious search for new markets and raw materials. It was now being defined mainly by the export of finance capital. These economic developments had political meanings as well. According to Hilferding, with the development of finance capital, various sections of the national bourgeoisie were becoming united as a result of a shared desire for international expansion and their shared antipathy for the labor movement. Therefore, in order to secure their collective interests, the capitalists took possession of the state apparatus and formed what the economists called the dictatorship of magnates and capital. This new economic order that Hilferding describes is what we would now call state capitalism, a term which Hilferding himself would not use, for according to him, the concept of state capitalism can scarcely pass the test of serious economic analysis. Once the state becomes the exclusive owner of all means of production, the functioning of a capitalist economy is rendered impossible by destruction of the mechanism which keeps the lifeblood of such a system circulating. A capitalist economy is governed by the laws of the market, analyzed by Marx, and the autonomy of these laws constitutes the decisive symptom of the capitalist system of production. A state economy, however, eliminates precisely the autonomy of economic laws. It represents not a market, but a consumer's economy. It is no longer price, but rather a state planning commission that now determines what is produced and how. Regardless of Hilferding's own view and the conclusions he drew from his own study, his book would directly influence Bukharin and lead to the development of his theory of imperialism and state capitalism. It was Hilferding's book which would inspire Bukharin to write Imperialism and World Economy, and from Bukharin's own study on imperialism and neo-capitalism, it would lead him to develop his own theory of the state. His book on imperialism, therefore, would spawn a direct sequel titled Towards a Theory of the Imperialist State. Bukharin's book on imperialism was received warmly by Lenin. However, in another article, Der imperialistische Raubstaat, were received quite poorly by Lenin. Eventually, however, these new interpretations of the state, which were in fact actually simply the old interpretations created by Marx and Engels, convinced Lenin to change his view on the relationship between revolutionaries and the state. It would lead him to write one of his most well-known and important books, The State and the Revolution, a book that was highly influential for the left communists as well. But it is Bukharin's book on imperialism that truly defines the direction which the left communists would take in 1917 and 1918. In 1915, in Bern, Bukharin would also begin associating with another young comrade and future left communist, Yuri Pyatikov, and his wife, Evgenia Bosch. What united these two was their shared condemnation of the concept of rights of nations to self-determination, which they had considered an outdated slogan no longer applicable in the era of imperialism. For them, supporting national movements was reactionary. While Lenin advocated the liberation of nations, Pyatikov spoke of the obliteration of nations, the destruction of national boundaries and borders by the proletarian revolution. In 1915, these three created a new magazine called Communist, which only published one issue, but in it contained a set of theses on the national question, anti-national and staunchly international. When Bukharin returned to Russia in May of 1917, 1 month after Lenin had arrived in April, He quickly integrated himself into the party machine and became a major leader in Moscow. There, he reunited with his old comrades, Osinsky and Smirnov, once more forming the Moscow trio. During this time, Lenin had made a sudden shift towards the left. Upon Lenin's return to Russia in April, he had made a sudden shift leftward to positions that were similar to Bukharin and the Bolshevik lefts. The moment he got off his train returning from exile, he called for a series of radical proposals that came to the utter shock of his old guard. Lenin's triumphant return to Russia in April 1917 produced immediate confusion in socialist ranks, to the astonishment of the Mensheviks and the consternation of most leading Bolsheviks, who assumed that the new bourgeois democratic regime must exist for a lengthy period during which the prerequisites for socialism would mature. Lenin defended his call for the transformation of the revolution into one for socialism. To give an example of the party position before Lenin's arrival, when Stalin returned from exile in 1917, before Lenin, he came to see that Pravda, under the reins of Molotov, was calling for the overthrow of the provisional government. Stalin, as senior leader, took over control of the newspaper and reversed the stance advocated by Molotov. The first revolution that Lenin accomplished in 1917 was in his own Bolshevik party. He began the minute his train crossed from Finland to Russia proper at Belustrov. When Kamenev got on to meet him, "What's this that's being written in Pravda? We saw several numbers and we really swore at you." Hardly any of the regular Bolsheviks in Petrograd, let alone the moderate socialists, were prepared for the uncompromising revolutionism of Lenin's April theses. Plekhanov called it a fantasia of fever. "Hatchet socialism," exclaimed the SR theorist Chernov. Lenin's speech produced on everyone a stupefying effect. One of the Bolshevik listeners recalled, "No one expected this. On the contrary, they expected Vladimir Ilyich to arrive and call Comrade Molotov to order because he had taken a particularly irreconcilable position with respect to the provisional government." It appeared, however, that Molotov himself was closest of all to Ilyich. The Bolshevik old guard was quite confused then, when Lenin began advocating for a revolutionary overthrow of the provisional government, because such a position was in violation to the one which they laid down in their program. When Lenin came back from exile, the first thing he did was denounce the provisional government. He denounced the Mensheviks and SRs as traitors to socialism. He attacked attempts at reconciliation being made between the Bolshevik and Menshevik factions by members of his old guard. In his April theses, he argued that no support should be given to the provisional government, that power should be delivered directly to the hands of the workers and poor peasantry, that the Soviets were the only possible form of government, and that the only possible form of defensism that was acceptable was a revolutionary war, which meant a renunciation of annexations and the shifting of power into the hands of the working class. With these new proposals, Lenin faced immediate opposition from the Mensheviks and the older generation of the Bolshevik party, such as Kamenev and Zinoviev. Another one of his seasoned lieutenants, Rykov, had deemed it unthinkable for a socialist revolution to occur in the most petty bourgeois country in the world, where the objective conditions did not exist. In order for Lenin to enact his program, he needed to discard of this cautious, moderate, conservative element of his party. He needed to, as Robert Daniels puts it, invigorate his party with new blood. For that goal of overthrowing the provisional government, Lenin recruited to his ranks Trotsky and his followers, integrated the Mezhrayantsy, interdistrictists, and former Mensheviks like Kollontai and Razanov into the Bolshevik party, and courted the radical Bolshevik left who were prominent in Moscow. These elements would be Lenin's sword, his vanguard for pushing the Bolshevik party into a revolutionary stance. Those left Bolsheviks who were prominent in Moscow we can refer to as the Moscow left for their concentration in the city, or as the 1905 generation, since many of them were younger members who joined the party after the 1905 revolution. As a result of Lenin shifting the party towards the left, Bukharin, while holding his left communist positions, would for the first time in July 1917 become a member of Lenin's Central Committee. In addition to Bukharin, two other Moscow leftists, Bubnov and Sokolnikov, were added as full members, with Lomov, who described himself as Bukharin's ardent follower, being added as a candidate. All in all, placing 4 Moscow leftists, 4 left communists, in the highest echelons of power in the Bolshevik party. Although the left had a strong position in Moscow, so did the cautious moderates like Rykov and Nogin, who were none too pleased with Lenin's leftward shift. In the summer The 1905ers found themselves in control of the Moscow Regional Bureau, which Bukharin had assumed a leadership position in back in May when he returned from exile. The Moscow Bureau was led by the pro-insurrection group, the Young 1905ers and Moscow leftists. The Bureau also held authority over the Moscow Committee, which was led by the older moderates. Among the leaders of the Bureau were Bukharin, Smirnov, Osinsky, Lomov, Kizilstein, and Innokenty Shtukov, all of whom were younger than 30 at the time, much younger than the leaders of the Moscow Committee. During the summer of 1917, the Moscow leftists set to work overthrowing the rightist leadership and establishing as well as disseminating the radical left view amongst the rank and file through their control of the party machine and press organs. The Moscow trio themselves took over two publications, Spartak and Social Democrat, in situations which Cohen describes as a virtual coup. When the October Revolution took place in Moscow, it was Vladimir Smirnov who was the leader of the Military Revolutionary Committee in the city. He directed its military operations, and it was Bukharin who drafted and defended the decrees in support of the insurrection issued by the Moscow Soviet. After the insurrection succeeded and the Bolsheviks were in power in Moscow, after power was placed in the hands of the Soviet, the two who were elected as delegates to represent it in Petrograd were Bukharin and Shtukov. Not even 1 week after October, Shtukov was already demanding that the Central Committee make a resolution on the Revolutionary War position. As I have already stated, Lenin's sudden shift leftward shocked the senior members of his party, but was accepted gracefully by the younger members, the more extreme elements of the party, such as Bukharin and Osinsky, as well as by Kollontai and Shlapnikov, the latter of whom was tasked with presenting Lenin's updated views while he was journeying from Switzerland back to Russia. Indeed, when the left communist opposition first emerged, one of its leaders would state that they were only representing Lenin's old view. As early as 1915, Lenin would speak of taking no separate peace with any imperialist power, of waging a revolutionary war, and he would continue this rhetoric throughout 1917. However, as the Bolsheviks came to power, Lenin would begin to wane on his support for this idea, eventually switching positions and concluding that the only possible choice was to make a separate peace with Germany. While Lenin dropped his support of the Revolutionary War, the left communists held firmly to it. They believed that the Revolutionary War that Lenin had previously advocated was a fundamental concept of Bolshevism. The first stirrings of such an opposition trend occurred in November 1917, after the resounding success of the October Revolution, when the Bolshevik Party, now in power, was forced to contend with the task of peace and the War of Germany, a task which the provisional government had failed with miserably. On October 26th, Old Style, the new Soviet government delivered a decree on peace. This decree had two audiences, the domestic audience of the workers and peasants of the nation, and the international audience, the imperialist powers and the people of the world. This decree was a proposal to, quote, all warring peoples and their governments to begin at once negotiations leading to a just democratic peace, and therefore invited, quote, all belligerents to open negotiation without delay for a just and democratic peace, a peace without annexations and reparations. This peace without annexations appealed greatly to the war-weary Russian populace, but to the Germans, who had essentially witnessed their enemy's army collapse in the wake of the revolution, it was not a peace acceptable to them. On November 14th, the Soviet government were thus forced to initiate negotiations for an armistice. Then, the next month, on December 3rd, a Soviet delegation was sent to negotiate with the Germans for peace in the city of Brest-Litovsk in modern-day Belarus. Later, this delegation was led by Trotsky, and the new goal was to drag out the negotiations as long as possible. Near the end of December, while the negotiations were still ongoing, is when Kowalski states that the left communists first began to form as a distinct political faction. As he puts it, it was Lenin's apostasy on precisely this issue, that is, his willingness to accept such a peace on German terms to buy breathing space for the revolution, that precipitated the formation of the left communist movement in late 1917. On December 28th, Nikolai Osinsky, Afanasy Lomov, and Innokenty Shtukov issued a resolution that demanded an end to the negotiations with Germany, and not just with Germany, but with all imperialist states. Instead, they declared that they must be prepared to wage a revolutionary war against both Germany and world imperialism. This policy of revolutionary war was dubbed as the Moscow point of view. Then, the major organizational center of what would later be called left-wing communism. Support for the continuation of the War of Germany on a revolutionary standpoint was popular with the rank and file in the Bolshevik Party. Local Soviets and party organizations opposed a separate peace with the Germans, and indeed, after the peace treaty was signed, some Soviets would declare themselves in an open state of war with Germany. For example, one such local council, the Okhta District Soviet, proclaimed, quote, that it was preferable to die fighting for international socialism than to wait to be crushed for the forces of international imperialism. Indeed, this notion was prominent with many left communists, that it is better to die sword in hand than to be strangled slowly and ungracefully. In the eyes of the leftists, making peace with the Germans was an abandonment of revolutionary principles and could lead to a degeneration of the revolution. They likened their situation to that of the Paris Commune. If Bolshevik power were to be sacrificed for the sake of the revolution, then so be it. They died sticking to their principles. The matter was not whether or not they survived, but the development of the revolution. They could all well sacrifice themselves if it meant the revolution sparked in the West. Uritsky would say, for example, that, quote, defeats can promote the development of the socialist revolution in Western Europe much more than this obscene peace. On January 8th, during the first discussion of the notion of peace with Germany, Lenin's proposal received only 15 votes out of a session of 60 members. Bukharin, who advocated for war, received 32. The rest went to people who advocated neither. To come to a compromise, on January 11th, it was Trotsky's plan, the "No War, No Peace" slogan, which was adopted. Daniels contends that for the left communists, the no peace aspect truly meant total war. Petrograd and other cities that were dangerously close to the front were at times centers of support for left communist positions. However, once negotiations broke down and the German advance renewed, cities like Petrograd began to reconsider their support for such a policy. On February 21st, the Petrograd Soviet voted in favor of Sovnarkom's decision to accept a peace with the Germans on German terms. On March 1st, there was still a considerable movement of opposition to the signing of the treaty in Bolshevik organizations throughout the country. From Astrakhan to Vladivostok, left communist positions held considerable support. It is even alleged that left communist sympathizers, who dominated the Far Eastern Bureau of the party, were prepared to split Siberia from the Russian Republic should the latter consent to peace. Lenin was well aware of the support in which the Revolutionary War position held. However, he did not believe that in the state that the Russian army was in, that such a war would be feasible, and resisted the push from the lower levels of the party to enact the Revolutionary War. On February 23rd, at a meeting of the Central Committee, Lenin had threatened to resign if the hotheads of the party did not stop their, quote, revolutionary phrase-making. However, the left were equally adamant in their position. Uritsky, Lomov, Bubnov, and Bukharin butted heads with Lenin. Most of the Central Committee, however, did not share the positions of these four. Trotsky, among others like Dzerzhinsky, were opposed to the left communist position of war. However, they did not feel comfortable voting for peace either, so they abstained instead. In the end, Lenin obtained a slim majority on his policy of peace. In response, Bukharin and many other left communists resigned from their posts in the party and government. Not eager to lose these members of the party, Lenin sought to compromise. Trotsky himself proposed a resolution that would allow the opposition to remain in the party but still defend their positions. And defend their positions they did, as they would go on to agitate against the peace amongst the rank and file. On March 3rd, the treaty was signed. However, at party conferences and meetings, the left and Lenin still butted heads on its ratification. Lenin stuck to his pragmatic stance that peace was the only option, while Bukharin, supported by Trotsky, despite abstaining, argued that peace did damage because it harmed the prospects of the international revolution and damaged the psychological capacity of the Russian people to wage a war. Despite the considerable amount of support the Revolutionary War position had initially had, this fervor for war had begun to subside further along into March. They, however, accepted that they were now in the minority of the party. At the session of the 7th Party Congress held on March 7th, Radek candidly admitted that, now, we left communists are the minority. By mid-March, when delegates to the 4th All-Russian Congress of Soviets gathered in Moscow, his assessment of the situation was apparently confirmed. At the Bolshevik caucus preceding the Congress, they could only muster 38 votes in support of revolutionary war, against 453 in favor of accepting the Brest peace. The dissenting left communists who had resigned were elected back onto the Central Committee, and the party moved on to new issues. The left communists had understood that Lenin had retreated on the old position of war, not just because of the state of the army, but also because of peasant pressure. But how much further would he retreat on socialist principles? This leads to the second phase of the left communist struggle, which occurred in the domestic and economic arena. Although the left communist movement came into existence initially as an opposition movement to the treaty, after Brest-Litovsk was signed, the left communist group did not die, but shifted their focus to the domestic and particularly economic policies of Lenin. The major leaders reorganized themselves around the weekly communist magazine in Moscow, which was edited by the Moscow Trio, now with the addition of Karl Radek. The signing of Brest-Litovsk and the consequences thereof had determined Lenin's new economic policy that was geared towards the reconstruction of industry and an end to the chaos which the Bolsheviks themselves had unleashed a year prior. For Lenin, the signing of Brest-Litovsk was crucial in order to gain breathing space for the revolution. The old army, not willing or able to fight, could not be relied on. A new army had to be created, a Red Army that was organized and disciplined like the German army. But in order to build that army, order had to be established. The construction of such an army presupposed an end to the economic chaos and disorder gripping Russia. The food crisis threatening the cities with famine must be solved. Its devastated transport system, especially the railways, repaired, and industrial production revived. If the realization of these goals required the collaboration of the remaining native capitalists, then Lenin, as it soon became clear, was prepared to come to some compromise with them in the short term for what he believed would advance the prospects for socialism in the long term. Lenin now sought to reintroduce labor discipline in the form of one-man management and the returning of hierarchy in the workplace. Lenin argued that state capitalism was the only way in which the catastrophe could be solved. It was necessary to fix the shattered economy and to raise productivity. For that, the new measures which he sought to implement were incentive programs like piecework, as well as the, quote, progressive elements of the system of scientific management, also known as Taylorism. It was these policies, in particular state capitalism, which the left communists attacked. They were also opposed to Lenin's agrarian program, which they quarreled over even before the treaty was signed. But in the months after the signing of the treaty, the target of the opposition was now the industrial program and the subject of workers' control. Unlike their previous opposition, in which they could argue that they were defending an orthodoxy as well as Lenin's old position, the Bolsheviks in 1917 had not drawn up an industrial program. Despite the lack of such a program, which the left communists could point to some sort of orthodoxy, they felt that any such industrial program had implicit policies that needed to be enacted, principles that were fundamentally agreed upon, those principles being workers' control and management, and the sidelining of managers in spetsy. They accepted that the spetsy, specialists, and the captains of industry had to be made use of, but under special conditions in order to maintain the political supremacy of the proletarian dictatorship. For the left communists, the state capitalism that was envisioned by Lenin was a step backwards and a potential danger to the future socialist organization of the economy. Lenin argued in his response to the left communists that, quote, in the first place, economically, state capitalism is immeasurably superior to our present economic system. In the second place, there is nothing terrible in it for Soviet power. The Soviet state is a state in which the power of the workers and the poor is assured. Thus, for Lenin, the state represented the will of the workers, and therefore state control was also indirectly workers' control. The left communists responded by saying, let us suppose that Soviet power, while organizing in name state regulation, in fact transfers the business of administration to organizers of trust, i.e. to the capitalists. What happens in that case? The real power of capital in the economy grows and becomes consolidated. Meanwhile, the political superstructure either little by little degenerates beyond recognition, or at a certain point bursts, because the protracted command power of capital in the economy is incompatible with the command power of the proletariat in politics. Despite this new orientation, with the signing of the treaty, the left communist movement lost much of its steam. Bukharin's main gripe in his position as leader of the left communists was based fundamentally on opposition to Brest-Litovsk. But during the economic controversy, he was not as zealous with his opposition. As Cohen puts it, with the ratification of the peace treaty, the movement lost much of its nationwide following and became even more of a Moscow operation. At the same time, Bukharin retired to the sidelines, issuing only sporadic objections to Lenin's proposals. while Osinski took over the leadership of the left communists in the economic controversy. Always more radical than Bukharin on domestic affairs, he became Lenin's most implacable and extremist opponent. In fact, Bukharin would state on the issue of employing specialists that he was farther to the right than Lenin. The later loss of Bukharin and Radek would greatly impact the remaining left communist ability as an effective, quote, opposition, since they now lacked big names who could act as effective leaders. Furthermore, the left communists lost ground in lieu of the lack of grip the Bolsheviks had over the country. The very survival of Soviet power ever more insistently demanded the speedy restoration of order in industry to increase production of war material. To many, Lenin's prescriptions seemed best able to produce such results, while the majority of the left communists were prepared to suspend their opposition in view of the growing military threats to Bolshevik rule. As a result, in the summer of 1918, the left communist group began to splinter. Eventually, many other opposition groups would evolve out of what was once the left communist movement of 1918, such as the Democratic Centralists, the Military Opposition, Myasnikov's Workers' Group, and the Workers' Opposition. However, by the end of 1918, the left communist movement had essentially died, not achieving any of its goals. Those who were members of this movement would go on their separate ways. Some of them would remain left communists. Others would join either Bukharin, Trotsky, or Stalin during the power struggle in 1923. In 1938, at the Moscow trials, Bukharin was accused of many things, but one of the charges was, and I quote, "In 1918, Bukharin and the group of left communists, headed by him, in conjunction with Trotsky and the left socialist revolutionaries. The aim of Bukharin and his fellow conspirators was to thwart the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, to overthrow the Soviet government, to arrest and assassinate V.I. Lenin, J.V. Stalin, and J.M. Sverdlov, and to form a new government consisting of Bukharinites, Trotskyites, and left socialist revolutionaries. In executing the plan of the conspiracy, the left socialist revolutionaries, in July 1918, with the knowledge and consent of Bukharin, raised a revolt in Moscow with the object of overthrowing the Soviet government. It has been further established that the attempt on the life of V.I. Lenin committed by Socialist Revolutionary Kaplan on August 20th was the direct result of the criminal designs of the left communists, headed by Bukharin, and of their confederates, the left and right socialist revolutionaries. The left communists had seemingly found an ally in the left SRs, considering they were both opposed to the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. They too were hostile to a separate peace with the Germans, and they were outraged when the treaty was signed. As a result of the treaty signing, they broke their alliance with the Bolsheviks and resorted back to traditional SR tactics, that is, terrorism. Mind you, however, the left communists were essentially doctrinal purists. They were prepared to split their own party in the name of purity, and one of their hugest gripes was Lenin's agrarian program, which he had essentially stolen from the SRs. If the left communists thus were so pure that they would break their own party, is it really logical to believe that they were ready to go and join with the ranks of a party whose pro-peasant program was in stark contrast to the proletarian absolutism by those such as Preobrazhensky, Osinski, and Bukharin, who were the resident peasant haters of the time? The left communists were prepared to sacrifice everything in the name of sticking to a Marxist program, adamantly hostile to the peasantry, while they worked with the party that advocated the one thing they hated more than anything, land reform. It must also be noted that Bukharin made no attempt at hiding the fact that the SRs approached the left communists. In fact, it was first mentioned by him in 1923 as evidence to show why discipline needed to be promoted and factions clamped down on. On July 6th, in Moscow, several pro-SR elements in the Cheka, as well as other left SR detachments, participated in an uprising, during the course of which they killed the German ambassador, Count Wilhelm von Mirbach, arrested Dzerzhinsky, and seized several buildings. According to Shapiro, the left communists, as early as April, denounced as foolish the fact the SRs did not accept the treaty. On July 4th, Osinski, 2 days before the uprising occurred, accepted Lenin's report on the political situation. Bukharin himself took part in the suppression of the uprising in Moscow, and following the uprising, Yaroslavsky anxious to disassociate the left communists with the SRs, denied any connection with them in the papers of Pravda. The uprising was put down in hours, the leadership of the faction was arrested, and their members were expelled from the Soviets. Later into 1918, during a revolutionary tribunal, all the leaders who were arrested received light sentences, only 3 years or less, and none of them were executed. The Red Terror that followed afterwards received its full support from the former members of the left communist movement, and they, for the most part, fell in line behind Lenin as the Civil War was gearing up. This is the end to part 1 of the video. Thank you for watching.